To recap on the first part, I introduced death mother as the feelings and behaviour that threaten the life of a child. Death mother goes from anything from infanticide to hostility to neglect to just not thinking this child is good enough or to not being around. In modern society, we see this as unnatural. We see women who live the death mother energy as being mentally ill. We see mothering as coming from the inside and as being instinctively all-loving, all-giving. But I also argued in the first part that evolution shaped us to take account of the environment that we're in terms of how we then mother our children. And I'm going to explore that in this part and in the next part, how we've evolved and why we've evolved to take account of the environment and for maternal emotions and behaviour to respond to that environment. So the first person to look at mothering within the framework of evolution was John Bowlby, who was a British psychiatrist, a psychologist and a psychoanalyst. And in the 1960s, he founded attachment theory. He came from a Freudian tradition, but he got very interested and excited by the work that was being done in ethology, in animal behaviour, and really thought that we needed to bring that to humans to understand human behaviour. At the time in the 1960s, ethology was a pretty new subject, and so people were looking at the typical behaviour of a species. They wanted to know, what did gorillas do differently from chimpanzees, and how did zebras behave differently from buffalo? So they were looking at kind of big picture, what are the big patterns of behaviour that kind of identified and were distinct to different species. And John Bowlby brought that approach to mothering, so he kind of looked at mothering as this kind of one behaviour. And he said, for babies to love mothers and mothers to love babies is taken for granted as intrinsic to human nature. So again, another person for whom that biology, instinctively unconditional love, is intrinsic to human nature. And that was as much as we knew of the biology at the time. But in the 1970s, there was a revolution in evolutionary thinking. And also because of the fieldwork, people were doing much longer studies on these creatures in the wild, on non-human animals in the wild. And what people discovered was that for many, many species, they evolved a range of different behaviours and responses, both in terms of physiology and in terms of behaviour, that they could sort of pick and choose from depending on their environment. Obviously, none of this is conscious, but that animals, there wasn't one way to behave that characterised a particular species. That for every single species, there's a range of ways to carry out certain of the challenges of life. So think about cars. All cars are there to get us from A to B faster than we can walk. But a car that's suited to going down a newly tarmac motorway is going to be of absolutely no use when you're bashing across a bush in Tanzania. There's no roads, there's lots of aardvark holes, there's mud, there's grass. You need, in that environment, you need a four-wheel drive. And a four-wheel drive that's going to get you round a bush area is going to be of no use in the Arctic, because actually anything with wheels in the Arctic on snow isn't going to work. There you need a snowmobile, something that's built on skis. So you've got these different variants of cars depending on the environment which you're trying to navigate. And it's the same for behaviour, including mothering. You've got different variants of mothering depending on the environment, the emotional, social and physical environment that a mother and her family is trying to navigate. The person who really brought this to our attention was Sarah Bluffer in the 1990s. Hurdy is a primatologist, an anthropologist, an evolutionary biologist and a feminist. And she wrote two paradigm-changing books in which she argues that mothering is not synonymous with unconditional love. That among many species, primates, humans and many other species as well, there's been flexibility built into how a female mothers her young, and that anything from full commitment to ambivalence to abandonment and infanticide are all part of a natural range of behaviours. It's easy to see why evolution might have produced an emotional system in which females are fully committed and love their infants. After all, evolution's about the survival of descendants. It's harder to see why evolution might have produced an emotional system where females might be infanticidal, hostile, ambivalent, neglectful of their infants. What we need to think about and begin to conceptualise is that we are the descendants of mothers who raised at least one surviving offspring to the age where that child could reproduce themselves. And in the environment in which we evolved, it was really hard to keep children alive. So in traditional societies today, between 30 and 50% of those children born die before they're 15 years old. We know that the figures were as similar, if not higher, for our ancestors. And when that greater percent, when up to half the children born are going to die before adulthood, that's what it's been throughout most of human history. Mothers have had to make choices. Are they going to nurture this child or not? And they have to take into account various factors when making those choices. They have to take into account factors in their external condition. That decision isn't always conscious. Sometimes it can be done through unconscious channels. But all the same, that is part of what has gone on. That's part of what's made up mothering. And I'm now going to start to talk about these various factors that have influenced human mothers through the millennium. The first is the resources available to her. It takes resources to raise a child. It takes calories that were hard to come by in many environments in which we've lived throughout evolutionary history. It takes time, it takes care, it takes emotions. Women have had to assess in some way or another, again, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, whether they have enough resources to keep this child alive. And if they give resources to this child, what's the effect going to be on other children? One way that's helpful to think about this is about birth spacing in societies where there's no birth control and where there's no milk substitutes, there's no formula, so young infants have to breastfeed. And a lot of work was done in the 60s, 70s, 80s on the Kung hunter-gatherers from the Kalahari. The Kung are a modern people, but their lifestyle is similar to that of some of our ancestors. And men generally do the hunting and women generally do the gathering. When women gather, they can be walking 5 or 6 hours to go out and collect tubers and nuts and berries. And when they go out, they'll carry any breastfeeding children with them, and they breastfeed children till they're 4.5 years old on average. So imagine yourself as a Kung woman. You've got a 2-year-old, 2.5-year-old, and you've just given birth to a newborn. What do? If you wean the 2-year-old, it's going to die. You need to be breastfeeding it for another 2 years. If you try to keep the 2-year-old and the newborn, you're going to be walking 5 or 6 hours carrying these 2 infants and then also carrying the nuts and the tubers. That's going to be almost impossible to do. So do you, not care for the newborn that you've just given birth to? Kung women unusually give birth in the bush, away from home. And if they were put in this position, they generally never picked up the infant, they just left it in the bush. And when Kung lived traditionally, more traditional lives, an anthropologist started working with them in the 60s and 70s, 1 in 100 infants was abandoned at birth to die. There's an anthropologist called Marjorie Shostak who sadly died many years ago, but she worked with a Kung woman called Nisa to record the story of Nisa's life. So she got Nisa to tell stories of her life and then she translated them. And these are Nisa's words about what happened when she was a 4-year-old, 4.5-year-old child, I think, and her baby brother was born after her. After he was born, he lay there crying. I greeted him. My baby brother, I have a little brother. Someday we'll play together. But my mother said, "What do you think this thing is? Why are you talking to it like that? Now get up and go back to the village and bring me my digging stick." I said, "What are you going to dig?" And she said, "A hole. I'm going to dig a hole so I can bury the baby. Then you, Nisa, will be able to nurse again. You are much too thin." Infanticide in the Kung, abandoning these newborns at birth, there was always regret, but it was culturally sanctioned. And it was sanctioned in nearly every other hunter-gatherer society that we know of. It's been a similar story for twins as well among many hunter-gatherers. A woman simply can't breastfeed two infants at the same time and go out and collect and gather food for other children that she may have. So, it's been couched in terms of twins being a bad omen or being bad luck, but generally one or both of twins have often been abandoned at birth. The resources that a mother has to take into account aren't just milk. It's not just about breastfeeding. It can be about how much food you have more generally. So between the 17th and 19th centuries in Britain and indeed in most of Europe, impoverished families would commit infanticide. Sometimes they'd just roll over the baby during the night, or they'd just neglect it and it would die of neglect. It wouldn't necessarily be overt infanticide. But the challenge was that if they kept this baby and it grew up, the household resources would just end up spread too thinly. You wouldn't have enough food to feed everybody, and then all the children would be at risk. This is an image from 1840 of a Russian mother who is literally throwing her baby out of a sled to the wolves. It's been part of pre-modern European behaviour as well. Japan in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was considerable records and documentation of infanticide, and the term that was used in Japan was mabiki, which is I'm sure I pronounced it wrong, but that's how it's written in English. And that's an agricultural term, which means to thin out densely planted seedlings so that the remaining plants have enough light and space to thrive. Again, you want to, you have too many seedlings taking the resources, none of them are going to thrive. This is a screen print from 1826. It's on the front of a book about this subject, and you can see a woman crushing her newborn. Although it's mainly been infants who are at risk, it's not always infants. So imagine that you're a mother living in a traditional society, you've got several children, the rains fail, and there starts to be a famine. So you've got much less food than you normally have. What do you do with that food? If you share it equally between 4 or 5 children, they're all going to end up severely malnourished and they're all likely to die. But if you favour 1 or 2 children, then you're going to increase the odds that at least some of them will survive. These decisions are rarely conscious. You might just think, well, she's a better eater than he is, or he's doing the herding, so he needs more energy. Or it may just be that, different amounts find themselves in the bowl without you consciously deciding one way or other. It's not necessarily that women have been making these decisions consciously, but these decisions have been made in our evolutionary past, and in the more recent past too, in pre-modern times. And the reality is that we are all descended from women who did whatever was necessary to keep some children alive. Women who acted fairly, who divided up their resources fairly between all their children, were at risk of losing all their children, and they didn't leave descendants. So how relevant is this today? How relevant is it to understanding trauma, to emotional well-being? It's very hard for most of us to think of food shortages, most of us in the West to think of food shortages. But in the UK in 2014, there were 500,000 children in what are considered to be food-poor households, children who weren't getting enough food. In the USA in 2016, there were considered to be 13 million children. Now, in our societies, that's not going to lead to death, but it will have an impact on health. It'll have an impact on long-term health as well, on how you age. It'll also have an impact on how well you can do at school. If you're not well nourished, concentration and ability to do at school is impaired. So it is going to have an impact on life chances. Even in our societies today, though it's not going to mean death. And I think even in households that are wealthy, have never experienced food poverty, where kids are never going to be hungry, a child's psyche is still going to be sensitive to feeling that they're an unfavoured child. Because if you get a sense that your parents prefer X or Y, the other children, for nearly all the times that humans have existed, to be a less favoured child would have been life-threatening if hard times hit. And so the kind of competition between siblings and feeling that you're not favoured is, I think, genuinely terrifying for a child, even in a very wealthy household, because we have generations and generations, hundreds of thousands of years, where that would have been life-threatening. The fact it's not today isn't very relevant in terms of those emotions. It's the same thing if you've been bullied and your parents or your teachers have allowed you to be bullied by a sibling, by your classmates, because the message is that you are not worth protecting. Push comes to shove, doesn't matter if you're hurt, if you're killed. So again, a bullied child isn't just suffering from being bullied, they're suffering because nobody has protected them, which tells them that nobody really cares about them that much. The second factor that Hurdy brought to our attention in terms of affecting mothering was the support that a woman has. So the first factor was the resources in terms of calories. The second factor is how much support she has around her. Human children are not independent when they're weaned. You have to keep feeding them. Adults have to keep providing food for them. In hunter-gatherer societies, depending on the environment in which they are, kids don't become independent in terms of food till anywhere between the ages of 15 and 20. So you've got all those years between a child being weaned and a child being able to provide its own food. That is not true of the other apes, of gorillas, chimpanzees, or of the other primates. Once an infant is weaned, it finds its own food. But with humans, that isn't the case. And what it means is that mothers are responsible for helping to care for and find food for several children at once. So there could be a 14-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 4-year-old, all of whom the mum has to be helping to get food for. That's incredibly challenging, and it's practically probably been impossible for one woman to do by herself. Human mothers have needed help in order to raise their children. That help's come from a variety of people. It's come from fathers, certainly, but you can't rely on any one person, be it a father or anyone else in our evolutionary history, because death rates of adults were really high. So if it's just the father and he dies, then you're absolutely stuffed as a woman. So what's evolved is a system where there have been multiple caregivers, where mums have drawn on a lot of people for support and for help in raising their children. A woman who's already got teenage children, they might help doing the childcare when mum goes out gathering, or they might do some gathering themselves, but they will help. Husbands will help. Grannies have been absolutely vitally important. A mother's mother, if a woman has her mother there when she gives birth, that has made a profound difference throughout our evolutionary history. In this photograph, you see a Hadza mother. The Hadza are hunter-gatherers that live in Tanzania, and you see a Hadza mother handing her very small infant over to her own mother. She's about to go out gathering. She's going to leave mum to look after the infant. Research in the Gambia showed that with women who are having their first and second child, if their own mother was there to support them through that process, it halved the rate of child mortality. So the normal rate of child mortality for first and second children was around 40%. If a woman's own mother was there to help and support her, then the child mortality rate dropped to 20%. That's a huge difference. It makes a huge difference to have this support. And Sarah Hrdy argues that because this support has been so vital to human mothers throughout our evolutionary history, women who don't have this support are likely to be ambivalent and reticent about caring for a child, because there's a very good chance that that child was going to die, that their caring would come to nothing. And so this probably wasn't a good time, a good child to invest in. Again, we see echoes of this today, albeit muted and titrated by modern life, but it is there. So young first-time mothers who've got a husband, or if they're single women whose own mother lives nearby, or even who have support from a community and a social worker, are more nurturing and more committed, and they form stronger bonds when they're infants than young mothers that don't have any kind of support network. And that can be measured, and that then goes through the child's life, that initial how the mother feels about the child. You can see the echoes of that going through the mother-child relationship. So to summarise this part, there is no one way of being a natural human mother. We as humans evolved a range of emotional responses, a range of physiological and behavioural responses to match the range of environments in which women have found themselves in. In this part, I've explored the availability of food and of support, how that affects mothering, how mothers who are struggling to get enough food, who have little support, are much more likely to feel hostile or ambivalent, how they're much more likely to express and live the death mother's energy. And I've talked about how we see the echoes of that today. In the next part, we're going to look at the third factor, which is the child itself and its characteristics, and how that then affects a mother's response to it.